Let me tell you a short story. There was a man who was electrocuted when he was young and had developed a terrible fear of electricity. He was living alone and one day the power went out. He avoided the electrical box and ignored the power outage, leaving him cold and in darkness. The man relied on candles and fire. He took comfort in them for a time, but started burning more and more of his belongings to stay warm. Slowly his home started to deteriorate from the lack of power. He finally became desperate enough and ventured out into the communal area where the electrical box was positioned. His neighbor noticed him lingering by the electrical box and asked if he was okay. The man explained that he was afraid of electricity and didn't know what to do. The neighbor showed him how the system worked and how to resupply his home with power. Light and warmth returned to the man's home, and he was able to live fully. This short story depicts the process of addiction and the pathway back to recovery. How do we overcome the pull towards isolation and reconnect with the source which fills our life with light and warmth? You're watching Archetypal Wisdom. Join me in exploring the symbolic truths and mysteries of humankind. Remember to like and subscribe. Now, back to the video. At the heart of addiction lies a deeper problem, an unresolved wound. This wound often originates in trauma, much like the man in the story whose fear of electricity stemmed from being electrocuted. This trauma typically develops in the relational domain. In other words, a core relationship will be violated in some way, rupturing essential trust. This will then become a part of the individual's core experience of the world, and then will compromise their ability to be in relationship with themselves and others, creating a deep sense of isolation. The individual won't have the resources to be able to process this pain fully, and therefore develop coping strategies. For example, a person might seek comfort in food, or perhaps they become fixated on their studies, or maybe they seek some form of adrenalized experiences. At first, these coping mechanisms provide a sense of comfort, much like the man in the story who found brief solace in the candles and fire. They offer temporary relief from the pain and isolation caused by the formative trauma. But over time, what began as a source of comfort spirals into an untamable hunger that leads to further pain. For example, someone who buries themselves in their studies may initially find peace in learning and validation, but this can grow into an all-consuming obsession and workaholism. What once soothed their struggle to relate to themselves and others now isolates them further, alienating them from loved ones. In this way, the coping mechanism that once compensated for the original trauma ultimately compounds it as the unresolved pain festers and grows. The person becomes trapped in a cycle where the coping behavior recreates the very pain it was meant to soothe. The more they suffer, the more they reach for the mechanism, just as the man burns more and more of his home to stay warm. By the early 20th century, addiction was seen as a hopeless condition. Medical approaches failed to address the deeper underlying issues, leaving many trapped in cycles of self-destruction. This desperate need for a solution led to the creation of the 12-step program, a revolutionary approach that addressed addiction not just as a physical or psychological issue, but as a spiritual one. The program takes the individual through a series of steps, and the core traits are centered around humility, honesty, accountability, community, and service. First, the individual recognizes that they have a problem and are unable to fix it on their own. Then they come to believe in God as they understand God, or a power greater than themselves, opening up the possibility of growth and change. Then they embody this by sorting through all of their errors and destructive behavioral patterns and admit this to another person, just like the man admits to his neighbor he is afraid of electricity. These stages encapsulate humility and honesty. Then the person seeks to make amends to those they have harmed, and then help others to go through the same process, which encapsulates accountability, community, and service. How do we make sense of a program that has been so effective in treating addiction, which is predicated on developing a relationship with God as one understands God, in our modern times? Well, to understand this, let's first look at how these principles from the 12 steps map onto archetypal, biblical ideas. If you look at the stories of the Bible, you'll see a complex characterization of God with these same motifs of humility, forgiveness, honesty, reverence for the beyond, community, and accountability. We see humility play out in its ultimate form with Christ living his life as a servant and ultimately sacrificing himself for humanity. He identifies himself as truth. In fact, this sets himself in opposition to the devil, who represents the archetype of deception and the pathway to evil. Jesus consistently defers to his Father in heaven, demonstrating reverence for the beyond. For example, his prayer in Luke 22:42, "Not my will, but yours be done." There is a clear emphasis on community in bringing forth the Spirit of God. "For where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am with them." Matthew 18:20. God's accountability is balanced with mercy. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. 1 John 1:9. So how do we make sense of these ancient principles and their effectiveness to this day? Well, one way of understanding this psychologically is looking at these biblical stories as being encoded with archetypal truth. This means universal patterns of behavior for humanity that have been proven over millennia to ensure not only our survival, but how to thrive. They claim to teach the way to life, which is encapsulated in the example of Jesus, and the way to death, encapsulated in the example of the devil. When we view the Bible's teachings through the lens of archetypal behavioral patterns, their relevance becomes clear. Both the Bible and the 12-step process emphasize alignment with God's will, a concept that may sound abstract but is actually rooted in deeply practical principles. These core traits, humility, reverence, honesty, forgiveness, and service, offer a tangible pathway for what the 12 steps has described as a spiritual transformation. In fact, if we for a moment turn to the Bible's outline of the devil, he is described as having deception be his native language, which aligns deeply with the experience of addiction and inner turmoil. Often in the process of addiction, the individual not only deceives others, but also themselves. They cling to their coping strategy through this deception as it slowly destroys them. In other words, the archetypal pattern of deception leads to destruction and death. When one actually embodies the core principles of humility, reverence, honesty, forgiveness, and service, they experience the promises of recovery which speak of peace, joy, and freedom. In other words, they become aligned with God's will through embodying these core principles, which can be understood as the archetypal behavioral patterns which lead to flourishing, just like the man who is able to reconnect the power supply to his home. In fact, these themes of isolation and connection to something greater can actually also be understood through the functions of the left and right hemispheres of the brain. The left hemisphere deals with details, it categorizes the world and delineates it into compartments and abstractions. The left hemisphere emphasizes boundaries and distinctions, which can foster a sense of separateness and individualism. However, the right hemisphere deals with the emotional sphere. It takes in the big picture of the world and understands the holistic interconnectivity of everything. It is the right hemisphere which connects us to our unconscious and intuitive nature. We have become more and more dominated by the left hemisphere in modern times, as Ian McGilchrist outlined in his book, The Master and His Emissary. However, due to the complexity of the world, McGilchrist posits that we actually need to be led by the right hemisphere. In fact, through this lens, one can understand that if an individual is dominated by the left hemisphere of the brain, they are going to be much more fixated on themselves and also see themselves as separate from the rest of the world. With this in mind, it's easy to see how this can lead to discord, because they don't recognize the many ways in which their behavior inherently affects the people and environment around them. This holistic interconnectivity, rooted in the right hemisphere's ability to perceive relationships and the bigger picture, mirrors the essence of God's will. Traits like humility, reverence, and service foster this connection, aligning the individual not only with the divine principles, but also with the fundamental interdependence of life, much like the man reconnecting to the power source. Interestingly enough, the Bible speaks of these matters as the battle between good and evil. It's tempting with our modern understanding to dismiss this kind of language, particularly as we now have a more detailed understanding of the cause and effects of behavioral and psychological dysfunction. Yet it seems that there is perhaps a profound wisdom in contending with these matters with this kind of reverence. We know that if psychological and behavioral dysfunction is left unchecked long enough, it can lead to such a dark place that what ensues next can only be described as evil. Our modern understanding of psychological dysfunction gives us valuable tools for healing, but framing these struggles within the archetypal lens of good and evil offers something deeper, a sobering inspiration to address dysfunction before it spirals into destruction. These ancient principles remind us of what is at stake and point us towards a path of renewal and thriving. This isn't to say that we should weaponize this idea of morality, which has so often been done in the past, but rather let it be a humbling reminder of the importance of addressing our dysfunction. Our modern understanding is critical in addressing the intricacies of a person's psyche, but the connection to the matters of good and evil can serve as an archetypal guide and inspiration that is still all too relevant. It seems the ancient solution for addiction reveals an essential truth about our nature and what we actually need to survive and thrive. You've been watching Archetypal Wisdom. Remember to like and subscribe. Stay wise.